Hello, welcome to this Brennan Center for Justice event. It's a really thrilling time to be having this conversation. I'm Karen Finney, and I'm looking forward to this discussion today about the fight to vote. The Brennan Center, as you know, is a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated with New York University's School of Law. As this is an election year, I think it's important to clarify that the Brennan Center is a nonprofit 501c3 organization and does not participate in elections or endorse or oppose candidates. Our thanks to our partners who helped produce this event. We are grateful to the New York University's John Bradamus Center, which advocates for civil debate on politics and public policy, and NYU Votes, which strives to give every eligible NYU student the resources that you need to register and cast their ballot. Please visit nyu.edu/NYU-votes to learn more. So today we are going to examine what's at stake in American democracy, and we have it's quite a moment to be having this conversation. Some 40 days before our presidential election, very consequential election. You know, the current public health crisis that we're facing, that is part of the barriers. This is an unprecedented moment. We've never conducted a presidential election in a moment quite like this. Intensified voter suppression efforts. I mean, it's not anything new, but I think we can all agree that what we're seeing this time is, again, unprecedented levels we've just not seen, in part enabled by technology, as we saw in the 2016 election, now in some ways perfected and upgraded almost for the 2020 cycle. And as usual, there are significant barriers for people of color in the forms of voter suppression. The Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County v. Holder ultimately weakened protections to the Voting Rights Act and the way states further oppress communities of color by purging roles and establishing discriminatory voter ID laws, which we'll talk about. So I'm excited to be joined in this conversation today to talk a little bit about how we got here and what we can be doing in this moment to address these challenges, because certainly our vote is our power in the face of all these obstacles and odds. I'm joined by Carol Anderson, who is the Charles Howard Candler Professor and Chair of African American Studies Department at Emory University. She is a prolific author and of several best-selling books, including One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy, and among other books. Dr. Anderson is featured in the new documentary, and it's fantastic. I've seen it. It just came out, although I feel like I lived through it a little bit because I worked on Stacey Abrams' race, all in the fight for democracy. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but you'll have to bear with me because I still got the scars from that one. Carol is joined by, and joining us is Theodore R Johnson. He is the director of the Fellows Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. His work explores the role that race plays in electoral politics, issue framing, and disparities in policy outcomes. He is retired commander in the U.S. Navy, following a 2-decade career that included service as a White House Fellow, military professor in the U.S. Naval War College, and speechwriter to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And in the spring of 2021, his forthcoming book, When the Stars Begin to Fall, will be published. And so welcome to Carol and Theodore for this important conversation. And so I want to start with, I touched on this a little bit, but with kind of a discussion around where we are, because we are, in 2020, I feel like we have said this over and over again, in an unprecedented moment, a global pandemic that we know is physically going to change manifestly the way people are able to cast their ballots. Some vote by mail, absentee, and as we're seeing, many still plan to vote in person, but in a very different context than we've ever done before. Then we have, as I mentioned, the voter suppression tactics They're not new, but it certainly feels like they have upped their game going into 2020. And certainly one of the things that I think we saw in the 2018 election that I think we're going to see again is not just the, sort of using incompetence to some degree as a tactic of suppression. And by that, I mean making sure that the people who are actually administering elections on the ground don't have all the information they need to do a good job. And then we're on the eve of the naming of a Supreme Court justice to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who we lost last week, and certainly our hearts go out to her family. And this, we know, is likely to be a very conservative judge who will, and we know healthcare is one of the first cases that will be taken up. And it doesn't appear, while I think the Democrats, there are some potential ways to try to stop this nomination from going through, I think most of us expect it will happen. And that configuration of the court has a bearing actually also on our election, should we have an election in question. And the last, and certainly not least, after this summer of, Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and racial reckoning and people taking to the streets to be heard in ways that we really haven't seen, I think, in over a generation, since I was in my 20s, that was a while ago. So, and frankly, I think you can we have to, as part of that, acknowledge what happened yesterday in Louisville, Kentucky, where, parse out the legalese how you will. I think for most of us, it just felt unjust. And on top of what we have seen over and over and over again, and we all have stories. This is a generational trauma that affects all of us. So we're going into the election also feeling like if you are Black in this country, you cannot get justice. So that's a lot. That's a heavy load. But I wonder, and Dr. Anderson, I'll start with you. Give us your thoughts on, the table is set for this election.
And I think it's set in ways that, we see the kind of turmoil. We see the Trump regime, hollering voter fraud, which is just a long history of what we've heard about fraud. And we see these different mechanisms, like in the midst of a pandemic, saying that you've got to get a notary public to sign your absentee ballot, or you've got to get witness signatures, which means that you're really violating the social distancing, that you need to be safe. Is that on top of all of that, what we're really seeing is an electorate that is ticked, that is determined, and that is through. They have had it. And I've heard we are willing to crawl through broken glass to get these folks off of us. That is why we're seeing just this kind of doubling down on how do we stop these folks from voting.
Dr. Johnson, your thoughts?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And this election, like probably every presidential election that has happened in this country, is going to be determined by which party is better at shaping the electorate, which party is better at getting their folks to the polls. And that also means which party is better at stopping folks from getting to the polls. So this is not an election that's going to be determined based on policy appeals on which Medicare proposal is better or who has the better national security strategy for the Middle East. That will certainly be talked about, but people are going to the polls to cast a vote for what they think the future of the country should be. And the parties are either going to help those people get to the polls, or they're going to restrict the access to the polls in order to shape the electorate. And what is very difficult this time around, and has been getting difficult for years now, this is what Reverend William Barber calls, Jim Crow may have died, but he didn't die, he just went to law school. Now he's James Crow Esquire. Yes. So a lot of legal tactics are going to be used to shape the electorate in ways that would have been explicitly racist in years past and now have the aura of colorblindness. And that is compounded by coronavirus, because now they could take measures that are ostensibly for public health, but have the unintended or intended consequences of shaping the electorate for particular political advantages.
Absolutely.
It's important in this moment, Dr. Anderson, that we kind of take a step back and think about historically how we got here, because obviously that shaped a lot of the way both the laws were written and what they were designed to do. My father was a civil rights attorney, and he would always say to me, you know, there's what we intended, and then there's what kind of happened, right? and sometimes, and that's not all bad, obviously. I think that's an important point to make. But if we think about, you know, the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, Great Society legislation, what did that accomplish in terms of political enfranchisement for Black folks? But then also, there was a political response to that that has shaped how we got here, that I think is important to give us some context.
And so I know you started in the mid-60s, but I've got to go to the end of the 19th century in order for this to make sense. Right. And I will do the Cliff Notes version. Mississippi looked up in 1890 and saw Black folks mobilizing and organizing with poor whites because the economic system was crushing both of them, right? And so Mississippi looked up and said, ooh, we got to stop this. And so they devised what was called the Mississippi Plan of 1890. And what it did was it said, how do you stop Black folks from voting without writing a law saying you don't want Black folks to vote? Because the 15th Amendment says that the state shall not abridge the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So they used the legacies of slavery as the access to the ballot box. So wealth, literacy, citizenship, and using those legacies without specifically saying we don't want Black folks to vote, is that the US Supreme Court, looking at the literacy test and the poll tax, said because everybody's got to pay, because everybody's got to read, this is legal. And these devices of the Mississippi Plan spread throughout the South. So by the time we get to 1940, only 3% of age-eligible African Americans are registered to vote in the South. 3%. This is why you have a Voting Rights Act of 1965, because we're looking at major counties in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, where Black folks are not registered to vote at all. And you get massive voter registration from whites in those counties. And so the Voting Rights Act was just landmark legislation because it did a preemptive strike on these kinds of policies. It said before you could implement, you have got to get the approval of the US Department of Justice. And what that meant was that places like Mississippi, where only like 5% of African Americans were registered to vote, 2 years after the Voting Rights Act, it was almost 60%. And this is game changer. This is huge. And you start getting Black elected officials, but you also start getting the pushback, because when you change the electorate, you are changing the policymakers and the politicians who are going to be crafting what this nation looks like. And in that pushback, we get what's called the Southern strategy. And this is where the Southern Democrats, who are wedded to white supremacy and anti-Blackness, are wooed into the Republican Party. Because the Southern Democrats are like, wait a minute, let me see if I get this right. Lyndon Johnson just signed something that said that the federal government's going to respect Black folks' rights and enforce them. How can we possibly be in a place like this? There's no place for us. And the Republicans were like, come to me.
I'm not saying that anymore.
Right? But they wooed that toxin of white supremacy into their party.
Yes.
And it was so virulent that what it did was it drove the Republican moderates out. It pushed the Republican Party so far to the right that it can't resonate. Its policies can't resonate with the desires and the wants of the vast majority of a diversifying America. So it had two choices: reform or suppress. And they chose door number 2.
Yes, they did. And it, you know, and Dr. Johnson, it feels like, you know, again, from that time to now, I mean, one of the things that made President Clinton's election so historic, President Obama's election, they changed the electorate. I mean, going back to this question, right? They sort of changed what we would say, we in politics would say the pathway to 270, which is the magic number in a presidential election. And most importantly, you had President Obama did this by literally looking at the additional changes in the country and said, we're going to go after young Black and brown voters who people tend to dismiss, and we're going to engage them. And we saw something similar in Stacey Abrams' race, where again, I can just say, having been part of it, we made a conscientious effort to go after Black voters that most people call low information voters, people who don't tend to vote. And quite honestly, it's so interesting to me that people thought this was such a brilliant strategy, because all it was, well, let's just go ask people for their vote. Let's just talk to people about what's at stake. But I wonder if from your research and your work, you could talk a little bit about sort of in this moment, how the sort of legacy of some of those things, those historical realities, and what we're facing now, and frankly, the sort of new tactics of voter suppression that we're dealing with now.
Yeah, so number one, especially when you look at Black Americans, but when you look at all Americans, we don't hold the same ideas about anything. And so in Black America, though 90% of Black Americans vote for Democratic presidential and congressional candidates and have for the last 5 decades, that does not mean that 90% of Black folks all have the same politics. Surveys routinely show that a quarter identify as conservative, just over a quarter identify as liberal, and about 45% or so identify as moderates. And yet on election day, they all check the box for the Democratic Party candidate. And the question is why? And it's because since the creation of the Black voter, after the Civil War, through the 15th Amendment on, Black folks have mostly voted as a bloc, because that electoral power helps shape what their cities, states, and what the nation will look like. And they are voting for the party that is for civil rights protections and against the party that is welcoming to those conservatives, white segregationists, white supremacists over the years who are actively working against civil rights protections. So we see the Black voting behavior we see today because it is a vote for civil rights protections, but it is not a vote for the entire swath of the Democratic Party's platform, suggesting that we all agree. The problem is when you have such enormous amounts of electoral power shifting local, state, and national politics, the parties recognize either we win with Black voters or we win by suppressing Black voters. The logical conclusion would have been, let's fight for this new block of power. And if we can win some, then we stop the other side from winning and we improve our chances. Instead, our two-party system of democracy has chosen to weaponize race in our electoral politics, where one party, the Democrats, cannot win without Black voters, and the Republican Party has stopped trying to win over Black voters. And that leads to the tactics. This is why Democrats want to expand the electorate, especially in Black and brown communities, and why Republicans are erecting barriers. And a well-functioning democracy, the type of democracy I think we all want, certainly the type we fight for at the Brennan Center, we want it to be more participatory and require the parties to work for the votes of all Americans. And if you don't have the best ideas, get better ideas, but don't shut people out of the process simply because you cannot win the argument. And what we're seeing in 2020 is a manifestation of this political strategy of dividing us along lines of race and suppressing votes of some and fostering votes of others in order to acquire political power that has very little ability to be responsive to a public that they're not actively engaging.
Right. All right. So there's another little fault line in here that we're going to talk about in terms of voting, and that's men and women.
Yes.
Dr. Anderson, you're going to be with me on this one. I mean, I'm not the felon. I'm coming back to you, Dr. Johnson. But why is it, and I will just share with you that I hate being called the backbone of the Democratic Party. I keep saying, I want you to treat me like a swing voter. I am we are the heart and the soul and the guts and the bones. But Dr. Anderson, what is it about? Because we know election after election, I mean, obviously the Black vote is critical. No Democrat, I can't remember the exact statistic, has won the presidency without a majority of the Black, without Black voters. They have not won with white voters. But it's Black women who really lead the Black vote. I wonder if you could talk a little bit talk about that and what our role is in this, what our role has been and is in this election, and how do we, I mean, I know we sort of take on everybody's job because that's what we do.
Bum, 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 bum. So I was, so Black women have engaged because they have a different vision. And it is a vision that's much more communal. It is a vision about how do we empower the we. And the things that Black women are fighting for are the things that not only benefit Black women, but Black men and the larger communities themselves. So when Black women are fighting about quality education, when they're fighting for environmental justice, when they're fighting for criminal justice reform, is because we know, it's like Lonnie Guinier talked about, that canary in the mine, is that we know that these things that are affecting our babies, our children, our lives, are affecting everybody else too. And so when we're hollering,
yeah.
Woo, I know why the cage bird sings. This is why we then come through in these ways of thinking about wielding communal power. We saw this in the fight for the right to vote that led to the 19th Amendment, but Black women were just, like, not y'all. And so when you look at the move to the Voting Rights Act, that really empowered Black women writ large to vote. This was an act that then led to the language requirements, so that if there is a language discrimination, then the U.S. Department of Justice would have to step in. So again, this broader vision of Black women leading. And then there's Black men. And they have a very different vision. And I'm going to let Dr. Johnson talk.
I'm going to let Dr. Johnson. I will just say one thing that I think is important in this, because I agree, Dr. Anderson, and one of the things that, I have this sign behind me that says Win with Black Women, which is a coalition of women that got together around, with nonpartisan, around the nomination of Kamala Harris, to say, we got to have her back, because having a woman on the ticket, just as having a Black president, starts to change the nature of the face of power and how we see power. And so, which is important because, as you mentioned, women have been leaders and in power positions throughout the movement for voting rights. We just maybe hadn't always gotten the credit that we've deserved, although we're working on that. But Dr. Johnson, I wanted to talk about, because I know you've written about this, and with male voters, what is the difference in the motivation, but also where are Black men finding themselves in this moment of so much pain and activism, but their own cynicism? I mean, we all have cynicism.
Yeah, so a few things up front. Number one, across races and ethnicities, men tend to be more conservative than women. And that is no different in the case of Black men and women. But there's some nuances here. One, the gender gap in turnout between Black women and Black men is higher than it is for other races. So Black women 10%, I think the gap is about 10%, where Black women turn out 64-ish%, Black men at 54. So Black women are more politically engaged than Black men. The other thing is, my research has shown that Black women tend to prioritize policy issues and the state of society when the election occurs to sort of influence the candidate they support, whereas Black men lean more on personality and sort of trust, gut instinct about candidates. What all of this means is still that you're going to get a lot of Black men voting for the Democratic candidate. Party is still the #1 factor in how Black people vote, both men and women. But in 2016, whereas only 4% of Black women voted for Trump, 13% of Black men did. That's 3 times the amount. Usually those numbers are much closer, but this candidacy, or Trump's candidacy, was especially unappealing to Black women. And for Black men, it was sort of a return to the mean. Trump only did as well with Black men as Romney did. So it wasn't like Trump activated this whole new group of Black men, and especially running against a female candidate. all he did was bring Black men that were already voting Republican to the ballot box. And the Black men that were voting Democrat, didn't come out at the same rate. So in some ways, what we're seeing are Black Republicans returning to the mean. Trump has still underperformed every Republican nominee since '64 that wasn't running against a Black man in his attraction of the Black vote. So even as he says, I did better than Romney and McCain, I mean, come on, they were running against Obama. I think in 2020, the last point on this I'll make is the one thing that is just as strong for Black men as party when they go to determine who votes or who to support is race. And so whatever sexism Black men hold, when a Black woman is on the ticket, and we've seen this in Chicago, we've seen it in Atlanta, in a number of cities where there are Black mayors, Black men will come out and support them. And even though Black women supported Stacey Abrams at 4 or 5% more than Black men did, no one voted against Abrams more than white women. And so for all of the disparity between Black men and Black women, they're still largely in solidarity at the voting booth and voting for the same candidates, and especially if that candidate is one of color, supporting them at a higher rate.
Before we leave, talk a little bit about, because you had talked, I know I've heard you talk about sort of some of the things that influence Black male voters in terms of economic stability. Sort of what are those factors that perhaps give appeal to, whether it's Republicans, President Trump? What are some of those things going into the election that we should be mindful of?
Yeah, so I think the biggest one is a Booker T. Washington sense of politics, which is the state's probably not going to do whatever it is you want them to do regarding civil rights. So the best you can hope for yourself is to work hard, practice self-determination, and secure your own economic security for you and your family. And in Booker T. Washington's words, there's never been a country that suppresses people that are large contributors to its GDP. And so his view was, let's create economic security in our communities, and then racial equality will necessarily follow. I think a lot of Black men writ large, but especially Black men who've been deprived of so much of their agency, latch onto this notion that I can actually be responsible for my own destiny, that I don't require someone else's help in order to make it in this world. If we look at things like the Black Power movement, the Black Panther movement, Black Pride, a lot of these were about self-sufficiency, recognizing that the government wasn't going to be there. So to the extent conservatism runs in the bones of Black men especially, it is around the notion that economic security is an essential element of racial equality. And what Jesse Jackson said in 1984 is that not only do we want our civil rights, we want our silver rights too. And I think that is the type of Black man that will support Trump is a superlative characterization of that maxim.
I know we're going to need to go to questions shortly, but I wanted to just touch on a couple of other things before we do, and that is specifically when we look at what's happening, Dr. Anderson, now in terms of voter suppression. I think of Georgia and what happened in 2018, and I'm going to let you talk about that, because if I talk about it, it's going to be some, but like, let's think about, particularly in the case of, I think it's important for people to also understand why we're still talking about Shelby v. Holder, and sort of that, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act that Democrats are trying to get passed in Congress. What if you can give us that perspective?
And so the Shelby County v. Holder decision, I think, will go down as horrific as the Plessy v. Ferguson decision in terms of what it meant for destroying democracy. So what the Shelby County decision did was it gutted the pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act. And that was the one where the state had to get the okay first from the U.S. Department of Justice or by the federal courts in D.C. What happened then was, like 2 hours after that decision went down, Texas immediately implemented a voter ID law that has gone back and forth in the courts and has been adjudicated as being racially discriminatory. And the reason why that works, again, we have to go back to the Mississippi Plan of 1890, where you can say we don't We don't want Black folks to vote. You can't write a law saying we don't want Black folks to vote, but you can use the societally imposed conditions to make that happen. And so with voter ID, it's not like any ID counts. These legislatures have particularly identified the kinds of IDs that African Americans do not have and made those IDs ineligible for access to the ballot box. They have also created the structure where, so that departments of motor vehicles aren't readily accessible in Black communities or on public transportation lines. So being able to get a government issued photo ID becomes very difficult. So we've had the IDs, we've had the voter roll purges in Georgia, exact match. And so exact match looks like what it's doing is dealing with issues of possible voter fraud, except voter fraud, of course, is, as they said in Louisiana, the courts just said not a scintilla of evidence of it. But what it does is it says your voter registration has to match up exactly with what you have in the state's database or in the Social Security Administration's database. But what it does is it privileges anglicized names. So if your name is Garcia Marquez, your last name is Garcia Marquez, and you write it with a hyphen, but the state's database doesn't have that hyphen, boom, your voter registration is kicked off into electoral limbo. If you write your name Renee with an accent over the E, but the state's database doesn't have that accent over the E, boom, you're kicked off. In October of 2018, so this is right before the November 2018 election, Brian Kemp, who was the Secretary of State, managing election that he's running in for governor, removed 53,000 voter registrations from the list. 70% of those were African American. So,
yes, he did.
Yes, he did. You know, and so we're seeing this. We're seeing massive poll closures because and all under the guise of being fiscally responsible, like the poll tax.
Yeah.
But what we know is that for every 1/10 of a mile that you move a polling place from the Black community, Black voter turnout goes down by 0.5%, up to 4 miles. So if you move it far enough away, you can get a 20% drop in Black voter turnout because it deals with access to the polling place. Georgia has shut down over 200 polling places, 75% of which are in minority and poor communities. That's what's happening, all under the guise of being managing our elections to ensure electoral integrity, while actually cauterizing and shaping who the electorate will be.
Right.
That's what's happened under Shelby County v. Holder.
And so today we have, and I would also just remind, some of the other things that we saw in Georgia that I think we have to be prepared for in 2020 were things like, because he was Secretary of State, he didn't give local county officials didn't have all of the guidance that they needed in terms of how to handle provisional ballots, and this is why I say this sort of ignorance, because then people were trying to do the best they could to make the best decisions they could. And I will tell you that with Stacey's campaign, because we had people in there the next day observing, we were able to catch it, because technically the other issue we were dealing with, and I believe this is true in a number of states, the Secretary of State doesn't have to tell you what's going on with the data, right, in real time. And so if we hadn't known what was happening, we wouldn't have been able to start fighting in the courts over what was happening. But I wanna, so Dr. Johnson, here's a fun one. Because, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is about to have a big couple of weeks here as he undermines our democracy yet again. He was quoted in the Wall Street Journal as saying that there is, quote, very little tangible evidence of this whole voter suppression nonsense that the Democrats are promoting. What would be and he may have said that on the same day Donald Trump said one of his things, but I can't be sure. But what would be your rebuttal to Mitch McConnell in terms of tangible evidence?
Yeah, so what I would say is that there is no tangible evidence of voter fraud. And so whatever measures you're putting in place, if you don't like that we're calling them voter suppression measures, and these are measures put in place to stop fraud, there is no voter fraud. The Brennan Center research has shown something like 0.0025%, which means a person is more likely to be hit by a meteor in their lifetime than to commit voter fraud. So all of these measures are not making our elections more secure. What they're doing are preventing eligible voters from casting votes. And that is not democratic, and it's not, again, not making the elections more secure. What I would say, and so Republicans will do what they do to win elections, Democrats will do what they need to do to win elections. What I would say to voters, find out what the measures are that are put in place that are trying to obstruct your access to the polls, and then surmount those barriers. This will require funding of grassroots organizations, mobilization at the grassroots level to help people get to the polls, help people understand what the laws are, help people get the right voter ID. We may not be able to change the law and the rules prior to November 3rd, but we can at least help people get to the polls and cast a ballot so that in 2024 and 2022, and in state elections, local elections occurring all in between those spaces, people can begin to reshape the nation to be more inclusive. So, if you don't think voter ID suppresses Black folks or people of color, just pay attention to the district courts, where they found in North Carolina, laws were crafted that targeted African Americans with surgical precision. That is a quote. We have the files of leaders going out, finding the ways that Black people vote and saying, that's what we're going to not allow anymore. So the question isn't about voter suppression if you're a Mitch McConnell. The question is, why do you insist that there is voter fraud? And why do every measure you take to stop this non-existent voter fraud, why does it just so happen to fall on the backs of Black and brown voters mostly?
Well, is it voter suppression? Does it run the risk of suppressing the vote if, let's say, I don't know, in a global pandemic when most people are going to have to be voting by mail, you remove mailboxes?
Yeah.
I mean, they might not say that that's voter suppression.
Right, but their argument is,
impact, right?
That's right. And so their argument is it's to combat fraud. And so the entire premise of every action being taken to prevent fraud is really cover, or at least, it is an action taken that has a disproportionate effect on communities of color. And so if you are a true leader in America and you care about our democracy, you should be more concerned about the outcomes of your policies than, how many laws you can pass or how many measures you can be put in place. Is what you're doing making our democracy more participatory? If the answer is no, then you're doing it wrong.
Right. Go ahead, Dr. Anderson. I see you wanted to get in on that one.
Yeah, so I think about what happened in South Dakota in 2018, where that state legislature, ostensibly under the guise of stopping voter fraud, said that you have to have a physical address on your government-issued photo ID in order to be eligible to vote. Well, 60% of indigenous people lived on reservations in South Dakota, and they didn't have a physical address. And right. So when you get a law in the fall talking about you have to have a physical address, and 60% of where you live, of the people who live there, don't have a physical address, what you have done is to shape that electorate,
right.
To remove them from having their right to vote. And so the indigenous leadership got up and they just said, son, you don't know my name. And they got GPSs and Googling out and created addresses, and then started printing up the tribal IDs with those physical addresses on them, melting printers in the process. And so when we see this kind of mobilization that you're talking about here, it is grassroots organizations doing what I call the heavy lifting of democracy. And they are working with their communities to overcome every one of the barriers that these regimes have put in place to block access to the ballot box.
So we're going to go to questions. This is going to be my last question before we go to questions, because I think, again, all of this is happening against a very dramatic backdrop where it feels like, again, and I say that because in my own lifetime, we have this conversation about race, and systemic racism and disparities, and we kind of go, you know, ebbs and flows. But it feels like we're in a moment where the injustice, I mean, the George Floyd videotape, we can't unsee these things. And it's not the only one, you know, Rochester. I mean, unfortunately, the list goes on, and it's Breonna Taylor, and it goes back to Trayvon Martin, and it's, you know, it's so many names. But I think it's important, you know, one of the things that I have found most heartening is just the intersectionality of people taking to the streets, young, old, Black, white, Asian, you know, Northern, Southern, all across the country, to say this is wrong. And so I guess my question, and I'll start with you, Dr. Anderson, I'll go to you, Dr. Johnson, and then we'll go to the questions from our audience, is how do we take that activism and connect for people that the way you change those systems is to vote? How do we turn that activism into activism at the ballot box?
And this is, it kind of reminds me of Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture in Lowndes County, Alabama, on the march to Montgomery, is that they went into Lowndes County with voter registration and talking about, what do you want? What do you want your life to be like? Understanding the policies that are attached to that vote, to those policymakers. And what we're seeing in these mass protests is that you've got activists on the ground talking about the policies and how those policies, what it means down ballot when you've got a DA or when you've got an attorney general that sees no real crime in the slaughter of Black people, that we have the power through the vote to get folks in there. That's how you begin to change, is you link up protest with politics.
That's exactly right. I would only echo that. You know, President Obama is famous for saying, don't boo, vote. And what I think the real answer is, do both. Boo and vote. And so what we're seeing, protesters, they are booing our government, our system of democracy, our politics, and they should also go vote. In this way, as Dr. Anderson said, you can shape the future of the country from within the system by voting and putting in good representatives, and then place external pressure on the system through protest and activism. Both are required if we want to create the nation that lives up to our professed principles.
I will say the other thing that I've noticed just in focus groups and polling work, for a lot of voters, white voters in particular, if you don't live racism every day, it's not as concrete. But I think when people saw the George Floyd video, for example, that made it concrete, right? And I wonder if sometimes that's part of the conversation when we talk about voter suppression, where they say, well, what's the proof? And you kind of, and we say, but it's, you know, it's, if you don't live it, it's harder to understand it. And so I do hope that part of what we are seeing is that this engagement and this activism, to what you both are saying, is we can boo, we can vote, but also we can understand a little bit better why these policies are restrictive and why these policies are create systemic inequalities in the way Black people are treated, the way women are treated. I feel like I need to keep reminding ourselves of that because we've just lost such a champion of women's rights in Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I'm going to go to some of our questions. One person said, how can we defend locally against the president's stated intent to negate the entire election? I know what I would say, but I don't know what y'all would say. We got that one tool, right, that we've been talking about.
Yeah. And I think one of the key things that we must do is really have massive voter turnout. So massive that the landslide is obvious and that there is not enough tweaking. And that we are simultaneously putting pressure on our state legislatures that you will honor the popular vote when it comes to electors. I mean, this is where I think one of the reasons why we're seeing this massive outpouring in civic engagement is that we understand that democracy hangs in the balance. And if we don't do this right, this may be the last election we have in our lifetimes.
Yeah.
And so That reality requires, as I used to say in church, it behooves us to move, to move with a kind of deliberateness in terms of voting, following up to make sure if we're voting absentee that our ballots have gone through and that they are counted. If we voted provisionally, it's to follow up to make sure that all of the documents that we needed to make sure that that provisional ballot counts, that we've done it, that we are fully engaged in this process. And it is a process that is about saving democracy. It's about saving this nation.
Yeah, and very quickly, I would just add that if you are able, volunteer as a poll worker. If the more poll workers that we have, the more likely we are to have polling stations closer to voters. If there are not enough poll workers, then the state will say, well, we have to, we only can have voting in this one big location, which is going to extend lines, et cetera. So one of the things you can do locally is participate in the electoral process on the delivering of the process side, and not just as a voter yourself. And that may be one way of feeling active and contributing to a healthier democracy.
Yeah. Just as an activist, I would say, make a plan to vote. Know what your plan is. Yeah. If you're check your registration and do it for. And one of the things I think we all often forget is we have our own, within us the power within our own networks. Make sure all of our networks. Are you registered? Go to probably, I would imagine if you went to the BrennanCenter.org or NYU websites, you could find some information. There's also IWillVote.org. There's Michelle Obama's When We All Vote, and find out, check your statuses and have a plan on the day. If you're going to vote in person, if you're going to vote early in person, know where you're going, know what you need before you get there, and make a plan. I think arming ourselves with the information, and like Michelle Obama said, take a brown bag lunch if you have to, although I hope there'll be some food trucks for people in line. But, really make a plan. Here's a question that's real interesting I want to toss out. So the consent decree that limited the Republican Party's use of controversial poll watching and ballot security efforts for over 3 decades was allowed to expire, and the Third Circuit Court of Appeals in 2019 turned down efforts by the DNC to restore that decree. How likely to impact the November 3rd election, and how can those impacts be countered? And Dr. Johnson, I'll start with you.
Yeah, this is a tough one, and this is something the Brennan Center is actively working to stop. Which is people coming either from within or outside of voting districts and effectively intimidating voters as they show up. This wasn't allowed, and as this decree being out of the way now sort of allows this to happen. This is reminiscent of the ugliest parts of America's democracy, where even when you had poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clauses, the one thing that always was there was the threat of violence. And there are pictures of Black men going to vote, Black women going to vote, with the boots of those who don't want them to vote headed towards people's faces, backs, and everything. And so what this decree could do, if it's not reinstated, is allow the threat of violence to be present when people go vote. And that we've seen the cable news videos of armed, self-appointed militias going to secure communities, and people end up dead as a result. We do not need this at our voting booths, and so this is a big problem. It remains to be seen the sort of effect it will have, but there is a long history of this, and we know what effect it has had. There's no need to prove what we know to be true again.
Dr. Anderson, did you want to weigh in on that?
No, he said it.
Okay. I got a question in here about felony disenfranchisement that I think we should definitely talk about, because we saw what happened in Florida. The question, which I'll pose, and then I think we can expand it out to this topic, is, does felon disenfranchisement affect African-American men more than African-American women? And I'll put that to you, Dr. Anderson.
So because of the disproportionate incarceration of African-American men to African-American women, yes. But what it does, I'm going to take Florida, because really what we're really honing in on right now is Florida. So remember, Florida had Amendment 4 And it provided for 1.4 million of those who had been incarcerated to be able to vote. Prior to that time, 40% of Black men were unable to vote in Florida because of a felony conviction. All told, it was a little over like 25% of Black adults in general were unable to vote in Florida because of a felony conviction. And so what you're seeing now is with the 11th Circuit's ruling that the basic poll tax, you've got to pay your fees, your fines, your court costs, is that's having truly a disparate impact on those who are impoverished. And we know that poverty and race are linked in American society. And when Michael Bloomberg came up with $16 million, now you've got the Florida AG coming after him saying, hey, you're violating our election laws. But when you were arguing before the court, that wasn't about your election laws. So you're seeing, when I talk about that kind of 1890 cover of using the conditions, this is what we're seeing with felony disfranchisement. And understand too, that Florida started its law. 1867 was the Reconstruction Act that said that Black men can vote. Florida's felony disfranchisement law came in 1868.
Right.
So what we're seeing is not an accident. This is purposeful, this is deliberate.
That's right. And, you know, there are two states where if you're imprisoned, you can still vote. And the one thing those two states have in common is that they're like 95% white. They don't have the history of Jim Crow, and they haven't had to contend with any sort of large, diverse presence. The other thing I want to say is there's a woman in Texas, her name is Crystal Mason. Crystal Mason was a small business owner. She had a tax preparation business, messed her books up, defrauded the government out of about $1.5 million and was sent to jail for it. She was paroled after 18 months, and some years later, 3, 4, 5 years later, 2016 election comes up and her mother says, you're back in society now, you need to go vote. She votes. They don't find her name on the voter registration roll, so she casts a provisional ballot, and then she's prosecuted for voting while incarcerated because her parole had not ended yet. They sent her back to jail for 5 years. She got 18 months for defrauding the government of $1.5 million, 5 years for casting a provisional ballot that she was helped to do by a poll worker at the location. And it was just put on appeal, and the appeal was denied. So this is the effect of felony disenfranchisement in the United States. And this is the sort of disproportionate effect it has on communities of color.
Yes.
There's a couple of requests in the chat here to talk about election observers and the need for election observers. And I wonder if we can talk a little bit about that and give people some thoughts about how we can do that. And certainly, I think there are so many dastardly things about President Trump and the things that he has said, and certainly I think the most recent comment about the potential lack of a peaceful transfer of power, I think certainly is meant to scare us. But at the same time, I guess I go back to, well, the one thing I know we can do is vote in those large numbers that we will need if we are in a position where we're having to have a fight about this. But I think, in that chain of events, getting to the polls and feeling confident that you will then have the opportunity to vote and that vote will be counted. Thoughts on how we get more people to be election observers, and why, and I know I think it's important, but I would love for y'all to talk a little about why that is so important, particularly based on what I think we're going to see on the other side.
I think that one of the things I'm seeing several organizations, again, the power of civil society, like the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, that are advocating for and recruiting people who have the skills to be able to watch what is happening at the polls, to serve as an observer, to make sure that the laws are followed, so that when somebody needs a provisional ballot, and if the poll worker is saying, no, you can't get one, to have somebody there to help understand why, yes, you actually do have the right to this provisional ballot, and these are the things you need to do. So they are recruiting, because my mother used to say, dog bites you once, shame on the dog. Dog bites you twice, he better eat you alive. and so we have seen what the kind of nefariousness that has happened at these polling stations. One of the things that happened here in 2018 was around the Atlanta University Center, is that they were doling out who would get a provisional ballot because the machines were down for so long and students were in line for so long. And they're like, no, you're not going to get one because we only have so many provisional ballots. I mean, so all of those things, having election poll workers there, poll watchers there, is to ensure that the rights of American citizens are upheld. That's what this is about.
Dr. Johnson, do you want to weigh
I
in on that?
absolutely agree. And I would just say, if do some research before you go and have a phone number handy. So if someone tries to prevent you from voting, like Dr. Anderson said, there's the Lawyers Committee and other organizations that are standing live, waiting for phone calls of issues so that they can help you resolve those things real time.
So here's a question for you, Dr. Johnson. Does the Brennan Center have a position on investing in a movement to amend the Constitution and create an affirmative right to vote?
So I don't know if there's an official organizational position, but at the Brennan Center, we are pro-voting. And so if that is more statutes, more rigorous implementation of the laws on the books, or a constitutional amendment, I think we're less prescriptive about the method and more prescriptive about the outcome. I think my personal opinion is that an affirmative right to vote should exist. In many states already does exist in state constitutions. It will probably be very difficult given our hyperpartisan environment to get one in our national constitution. And so whatever can be done statutorily, either through Congress or again, bolstering state statutes, I think it's a very good move to have and a step that should be taken.
And I'll just add that Senator Durbin, I think it was last month or the month before, actually proposed a constitutional amendment with the affirmative right to vote.
Mm.
And Dr. Anderson, why don't you just explain why why that's necessary?
Because the 15th Amendment says, the right to vote shall not be abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So what these states have done is to say, okay, then we're going to discriminate against your right to vote, but on other standards that aren't race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So therefore, we're not in violation of the 15th Amendment, making it really clear you can't violate American citizens' right to vote, period. Then cuts out all of the wiggle room.
Couple questions in the chat that I want to put to all of us to respond, which is, because of COVID, a lot of folks are confined to their homes. And so they're asking, what can I do to help fight voter suppression, both whether it's where I am in Georgia or I'm in New York where it's not going to be, it's not as much of an issue, but is there somewhere, how can I help somewhere else from my apartment in New York? Why don't we give folks some ideas about how they can do that?
So there are wonderful organizations out there that are doing the work, and they're doing the work in multiple ways, and they need funding. So they need funding, they need folks who are phone banking, volunteer, write a check if you can. And the organizations we know, such as the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, such as the ACLU, such as Black Voters Matter Fund, such as Voto Latino, all of them need help. And this is what you can do from where you are.
That's right. And the Brennan Center for Justice is another one of those. BrennanCenter.org, there's a donate button, you can click that, and we will wage the fight on your behalf to ensure our nation is our democracy is inclusive. The other thing I would advocate for people to do, in political science, we have found that when you post that I voted sticker, that actually has a mobilizing effect on those around you. And so the more you show that, you show that you voted and share your stories of what it was like, that actually makes the experience personal and mobilizes people to go do the same. Because no one wants to be the person that didn't participate, and so that fear of exclusion is actually a mobilizing thing. And that's one small thing folks can do to help give people the confidence and the resolve to overcome some of the suppression they may encounter.
we are going to need to close the program, and I apologize. There's a lot more questions in the chat that I didn't get to. I'm going to do a lightning round here as we close, and I will start with you, Dr. Johnson, and go to you, Dr. Anderson, and that is last piece of advice to people watching about, for this election, what they need to know and what they need to do.
Yeah, no matter what your politics are, no matter where you fit on the ideological spectrum, exercise your right to vote. Do not let that right be stripped away from you by folks who want to make it more difficult, who want to make it inconvenient. Do not be convinced that your vote doesn't matter. There's going to be a lot of disinformation and propaganda out there. Don't buy it. Whatever it takes, use the right that you have been granted by many people who have gone before us, and many that have given their lives to vote in order to shape the future of our country. And do not let yourself be deterred by any sort of measures or information out there that would try to convince you otherwise.
And I would say, make sure you have a plan. You must vote, but make sure you have a plan. If you're going to vote by mail, make sure you have a plan on how you're doing that, making sure that you're signing every place that you need to sign, and that you're putting it in a drop box, or dropping it off at the Board of Elections, that you have followed through to make sure that your power, because your right to vote is your power, is not being ceded, is not being diminished. That's what I would say. Make sure you have a plan, and then tell your people around you.
That's right. And I think my last piece would be I think we all have to be patient on election day. If you can vote early, vote early. Please do. If you are voting on election day and it feels like it's getting hectic and chaotic, or the hours are running long, just, be patient, stay in line. That's part of why we're asking folks to make a plan, to try to be prepared. And I think we all have to understand this election is not going to look and feel like anything we've ever experienced. We've got to be prepared that we may not get it's not going to be, I say to people, you're not going to be watching television with the numbers coming in at a fast clip. It's going to be a little different than that. And we could do a whole panel on that, but I think it's important to try to say to people, be prepared, stay calm. Someone asked about election protection hotline number, and that is 866-OUR-VOTE, or 866-687. They're missing a number. So let's go with 866-OUR-VOTE. Also, we'll just repeat, go to BrennanCenter.org for all kinds of great information to help you. Again, if you want to figure out about registration, where you're going to vote, what have you. I think you can certainly also go to nyu.edu/NYUvotes. Another great website is iwillvote.com. So a lot of great resources out there. Share it with all your friends. Make sure you have your sticker. Get your sticker. Maybe that should be the slogan. Get your sticker.
Get your sticker.
But thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to the Brennan Center. Thank you to NYU. Thank you, Dr. Theodore Johnson. Thank you, Carol Anderson. I'm Karen Finney. This has been such an honor to be with you. And thanks, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.